building on the previous lecture, which set out the larger questions for the semester, this particular short lecture is looking at how we can apply that particular idea of rethinking and recentering the narratives of Asian American history, particularly as we think of it from a Pacific/Indian Ocean perspective rather than from an Atlantic/Western European perspective of world history. So we're going to begin by looking at Orientalism. There is a short clip with an interview with Edward Said, who is the author of this particular text, Orientalism. Edward Said passed away in 2003. He is a Palestinian scholar, and so his particular work, Orientalism, focused on the idea that as he was examining the works and the literature that discussed his homeland, in particular Palestine, but also the region of the world where his homeland was, the Middle East, he noticed that through the literature, through the artwork, really through the culture about that particular region, he noticed that there was a very, very clear binary relationship between the way that the West envisioned and really discussed the idea of quote unquote the East, or in this case, the Orient. So, what does he mean by the Orient? Again, this is based upon his analysis of works written in Europe by European scholars about this particular land, again, in the 13th through the 15th century, really defining it as this area of Arabia/Islam, right, the Middle East, but then also noticing that that particular notion of Orientalism, right, creating this particular territory as being of one specific mindset that is in direct opposition to quote unquote Western thought, then extended to other parts of the globe, further and further to the east, places like India, as well eventually as China and East Asia, and then also really encompassing a larger colonial mindset. So that's really what Said is looking at. And again, the interview clip that I'm asking you to watch articulates how he comes to the notion of where Orientalism develops, but also how it replicates itself as a form of thought, as a way of approaching different lands that aren't Europe or aren't, again, specifically Western Europe. So in these particular pieces of literature, in the artwork, in the history, in the travel logs that are written about these locations, it is about a colonial relationship that is being articulated. The idea that these particular territories, Middle East, India, are thought of as less advanced, less primitive, or more primitive, and less developed, and therefore are sort of natural to be taken over by, to be really conquered by forces in the West. And really, again, thinking about this idea of geography, right? The fact that these are places on a map that are then defined by that particular relationship of the colonizer and the colonized. So as you watch that particular clip, notice how he talks about the fact that these are not necessarily truths, these are not accuracies, these are really envisions, right, or visions, imaginary ideas created by the West that are replicated not over a period of 10 years or 100 years, but really over centuries that in many ways reinforce that particular thinking towards these different parts of the globe from the Western perspective. And we can think about that that's also really established in the development of the era of exploration that's known really between, again, 1400 and 1600. And as you look at that particular period, right, these sort of ocean-going voyages that are, emanating out from Spain and Portugal, the first thing we have to think about is how eventually that becomes the narrative about the Americas, especially about North America. It is that idea that Columbus discovers the Americas, which of course discounts the fact that there are people living there for millennia prior to contact with, Europe, and also the idea that perhaps there's also earlier contact that predates that European contact with Pacific Islanders who are sailing from, eastward from the, Asian coast from and through the Pacific Islands and then making their ways to the western coast of South America, that's a very, very different narrative of exploration than the one that is privileged primarily in the West. And again, this becomes this competing narrative of westernization, right? The idea that the quote-unquote New World is becoming civilized through its contact with these Western powers, again, primarily Europe, versus the idea that southernization, which again has emerged in world history over the last 30 years, as a different theory. The Intercaetera, which is a papal decree. Again, this is also going to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493. This is a decree coming from the Pope, the Vatican, in Rome, that says that for the exploring nations in the world, they are free to claim the previously unclaimed territory in this quote-unquote New World that will become known as the Americas, as long as they do so in the name of God, right? If they are doing it in the name of conversion, of the people they are encountering and turning them into quote-unquote a Christian following people, that they are given the right, the authority by the Vatican to claim those lands under that authority. Why the Doctrine of Discovery is so important is that it is essentially a founding piece of English law, which again establishes authority over its colonial possessions across the globe. It is so important that the Doctrine of Discovery is also really important in U.S. law in terms of how the United States determines its right to own land in North America, particularly in disputes with tribal nations, right? The idea that because the United States is given the authority by this kind of ancient piece of, law that's granted by the Pope, and it is embedded in English law, and it's that piece of English law which is also embedded in the logic and the design of the U.S. Constitution, that is what gives the authority of the United States to claim these lands. And again, this is part of Supreme Court decisions which really emerged in the 19th century. So this is part of why the Doctrine of Discovery, even though it is over 500 years old, is really important even in United States legal history. The other thing we want to look at in terms of the authority of the Vatican is the Treaty of Tordesillas. Why is it important? Well, again, this is in 1494, and to really prevent the ongoing conflict between Spain and Portugal, which were the two primary nations competing over territory in the quote-unquote New World, the Americas, the Pope basically negotiated a treaty between these two nations, which were both Christian nations. They would divide the globe into half. You can see that dividing line there, and that everything to the west of that line would belong to Spain. Everything to the east of that line would belong to Portugal. And that is literally how they divide the globe in 1494. And again, you can see the sort of the influence of Spanish colonialism in places like not only Central and South America, but really to the western side of South America, whereas the Portuguese influence in South America is really limited to that eastern edge of Brazil. And again, this is all done under the auspices of the Vatican, under the authority granted by the Pope. When we talk about Southernization, that's really a different approach towards global history, world history. And what it does is it really argues for the development of human civilization and human trade, especially commerce, along these trading routes that predate European exploration. That much of this development about trade and exchange, and especially about the importance and significance of religion in these areas of Asia, all take place along the Indian Ocean trading routes, which are really influenced by the discovery of the monsoon winds, and also by the overland trading routes that take people from Egypt all the way to China as well. And again, in this particular world that exists prior to the 1400s, you actually do have an interchange of commerce, religion, culture. It is one that is multi-ethnic because you are talking about African nations, Middle Eastern nations, South Asian in India, Eastern Asian in China, as well as Pacific Islanders in places like current-day Indonesia, the Philippines. This is part of a larger exchange of ideas, exchange of goods, and again, exchange of culture really throughout this time period, really from the 9th century on. And again, this is also about largest economies in the globe all belong in Asia. And so it's really the desire for these Western nations in places like Europe, right? The English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they are looking for a more direct route to Asia. More importantly, a route that does not force them to go through these already established trade routes where they would either have to pay tariffs or risk losing their cargo because they are competing with sometimes hostile nations. So instead of going eastward, they look to go westward and try to find a more direct route to Asia. And of course, that's what really spurs the Columbian expedition, that then will, quote unquote, discover / run into the Americas. The other thing we can think about is how that once you have this particular discovery of, an intervening, landmass, by going westward, that it's also something that the Spanish take advantage of in terms of creating a different kind of trade route that involves not only goods being taken from the Americas and gold being taken from the Americas into the Philippines and into China that will then be traded further west into places like Europe. It also establishes the movement of peoples because this is also a labor exchange between people coming from China, from the Philippines, and then going to the Americas and then back and forth across. And again, this is also really aided by the presence of Pacific Islander sailors who really do provide the knowledge, the guidance of how to navigate the Pacific Ocean, without, the maps that exist, right? They can do this primarily by their understanding, their knowledge of, navigation by the stars, but also the currents that exist in the Pacific Ocean. And so in many ways, you have the development of a world economy in this period from, the 1500s really through the 1900s that really is built upon the significance of the Pacific Ocean and really the desire to get to this particular portion of Asia that drives much of the development and much of the exchange and much of the conflict really from the period from the 1500s through the early 1800s. And again, in this time period, you really do get the creation of labor, the movement of labor, both as enslaved labor, as indentured labor, but also as voluntary labor in the exchange between Asia and the Americas. And so that's really where we can think about the readings and the videos that will introduce us to the larger narrative of Asian American history, really the presence of Asians in the Americas, especially North America / the United States, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. So this is where we can think about a larger question. Again, think about that idea of the timeline. where do we start that particular quote unquote beginning for Asian immigration into the Americas? How far back do we go? Where do we start to see the most significant numbers of Asian immigrants coming to the Americas, and what really drives that particular immigration? As you're doing the reading, as you're looking at the documentaries, one of the things we want to keep in mind is that there are not necessarily radically different views, but different points of emphasis, whether it's coming from China, whether it's coming from India slash South Asia, whether it's the importance of Pacific Islanders, that really we're thinking about where do we begin this particular timeline. So this is one of the larger questions that's being addressed in the discussion board questions for this week. We want to think about how Lee's text provides a slightly different focus, not necessarily a different answer, but a different beginning timeline, differing emphases in terms of what motivates these individuals. And again, where do we actually begin in terms of this timeline for Asian American history? And again, compare that to the way that the narratives begin in the Chinese Exclusion Act segments that I'm asking you to watch, and the episode Asian Americans Breaking Ground that I'm asking you to watch for this week as well. The timeline exercise for this particular week is really designed to get you to think about how do we identify and organize these significant moments in Asian American history. Remember that the larger question is always narrative. What's the narrative? And even timelines can provide a narrative. So for your assignment this week, what I'd like you to do is to use the introduction and part 1 of Lee's text alongside the documentary videos and choose out 5 different dates that may be significant in terms of understanding Asian American history. Place the dates into a document. Again, pair them with a specific event, specific significant moment in Asian American history, and then in a really, really brief essay, about 250 words, explain briefly why you chose those dates. And remember that your timeline should be organized in chronological order from the earliest event to the most recent event. And that's, again, how you want to not only format it, but also set up the discussion of why you're beginning at one point and why the other points, the other dates in your timeline exist. In that document, once you've completed, make sure you proofread it, make sure that you have all the information that you need, and then submit that to Canvas before the due date. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you again next week.